This is our second lecture on Chapter 17. So this is talking about the United States in World War II and fighting in the European theater of operations. We left the story at the end of the Chapter 16 talks with the United States and Britain joining forces. December 8th, 1941, the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt declares war on Japan. On the 11th, Germany and Italy have declared war on the United States. The United States is now uh, joining the Allied powers officially against the Axis powers. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill leaves England and arrives in the United States and is going to spend 3 weeks at the end of 1941 into 1942 at the White House. And there he's able to sit down with the Americans as they try to come up with a plan of action. He's able to convince Roosevelt that attacking North Africa is the best play for the United States. And so that's what he's going to do. Right? Meanwhile, while this is happening, we've touched on this before. We have the Battle of Atlantic that now is officially raging in the coast off the United States, as Germany is trying to prevent food and other war materials from reaching Great Britain and Russia from the great industrial power that is the United States of America. For a long time, it's going to look very successful up into the 1942 and 1943. It's a very close run thing. And again, without some major innovations and some pretty impressive uh, computer work at the end of the British, and by some heroic actions, uh, Britain is able to survive from this. The Allies respond similar to how they did in World War One with the convoy system, where instead of sending out individual ships as they're loaded up, sending out one mass from there. Again, as we talked about with World War One, in order to prevent to limit the opportunities for those German wolf packs to find from stuff from there. They're escorted uh, across the Atlantic by destroyers equipped with sonar and accompanied by airplanes that use radar and be able to look down on the ocean as spotter planes in order to be able to try to contain the U-boat threat. By mid 1943, the crash shipbuilding program, like we talked about with the Kaiser shipyards and the Liberty ships, and the convoy system has helped turn the battle against the U-boats and helped lead to the successful maneuvering of not only material and manpower to the European theater of operations. So again, the key thing that happens at the end of 1941 is that Winston Churchill, with his characteristic cigar there, has moved into the White House and is spending time with the Americans trying to hash out a plan of action. One thing that they come up with is the introduction, again, the use of convoys in order to be able to help prevent uh, threats for the U-boats. And again, through this and other measures, they're able to do that. And so as we move into the Eastern Front and the Mediterranean, a key moment happens towards the end of 1941. That's the Battle of Stalingrad. November of 1941, the Germans have been stopped outside of Moscow and Leningrad. And again, the losses for the Soviet Union in 1941 are truly staggering. They have casualties ranging in the size of what American losses at the Battle of Antietam were every single day in terms of captured, killed, or wounded. And the Germans, thanks again to the Russian General Winter and pretty determined and harsh fighting from there, are slowed down. So in the summer of 1942, Hitler is going to relaunch another offensive. And instead of attacking towards Moscow, he's going to congregate a lot more forces south in order to be able to capture the oil fields in the Caucasus Mountains. Along the way, he wants to wipe out the city of Stalingrad right from there. Now, again, Stalingrad strategically doesn't have a whole lot of importance. It's more like Hitler's just saying, hey, I can really, ha ha, ha, Joseph Stalin, I took out the city that bears your name, and Stalin is not going to let you do this. So you can kind of think of like two prize fighters slowly circling towards this city or from there. By September of 1942, the Germans control 90% of the city, but again, the winter sets in, setbacks from there, the Soviets rally, then encircle the Nazis, and by January 31st of 1943, the Germans are forced to surrender. The Germans are going to lose over 230,000 soldiers, captured, killed, and wounded casualties, while the Soviets are going to lose 1.1 million from there. And this marks an important turning point in the war for two major reasons. One, Stalingrad is the first kind of clear thing where the Russians show that they can win, and the Germans are going to be, for the most part, on the retreat in the Eastern Front, and the Russians are going to be in advance. nobody's waking up on February 1st, 1943, and saying, "Up, the war has turned a major point here." We can really see this from the viewpoint here in 2020. But again, you really can kind of sense that for the first time, the Russians are able to wipe out, and this is the entire German army. This is, I think, it's the Sixth Army who's captured there from this. And secondly, this is an important thing for the United States, army planning wise. 1943 is still relatively early on with the United States planning and getting their military built up here. But what this shows the United States is that they can actually count on the Soviets to start winning battles. And so because of that, they move down the size of what they're planning on building their own eventual U.S. Army to be. They was the 90 division gamble of what they're going to do. So the United States is gambling on that. They're going to spend more of their manpower building machines back at home rather than putting into the armed forces like other allied nations are going to do. So again, we spent a lot of time in this in world history talking about Stalingrad, but again, important turning point in the war. And so, as Churchill recommends, the United States is going to first send soldiers to North Africa. Stalin has been pressuring the Allies for creating a second front, the first front between Germany and the Soviet Union in the east. He wants Britain, France, and the United States to attack from the west. And so he's been pressuring for this and asking for this, but Churchill doesn't think the Americans are ready. And so he argues them down with the invasion of North Africa to try to be able to relieve pressure on bring the English forces in Egypt fighting Erwin Rommel and the Africa Corps from there. The Americans put General Dwight D. Eisenhower in charge of what's called Operation Torch. Operation Torch is the invasion of North Africa by the Americans. This takes place in November of 1942, where Americans land in three separate places near Iran, Casablanca, and Algiers along the North African coastline in order to be able to take on the Germans and Italians there. North Africa is a good warm-up point for the United States Army. It's going to make a lot of costly mistakes. The famous first major engagement of Kasserine Pass between the United States and Germans goes very wrong for the Americans. And again, even mistakes like how do you load ships back up in the ports of the United States? The people back in the USA trying to be nice, like, oh, the soldiers are going to need ping pong balls and they're going to need Coca-Cola, so let's make sure we get that on there. But I mean, we can make sure we get all the bullets on there. So all the bullets are at the bottom of the ship, Coca-Cola, ping pong balls at the top. Well, what happens when you get over to North Africa? What's on the top? Well, you can't get the bullets the soldiers need because you got to take out all the Coca-Cola, you got to take out all the ping pong balls. So it's stuff like that down to how do you load these ships to be more effectively to be unloaded that again they're still making and figuring out from there. After a lot of heavy fighting, the last Germans in Africa are forced to surrender in May of 1943. So this is again Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, and again they come from there. Now, who are manning the defenses of a lot of these places in North Africa are the French forces under the command of the Vichy French government, which is the government in France working in conjunction with the Nazis. So a lot of these French soldiers are kind of technically fighting for France, but this is a France that's kind of a puppet government for the Nazis. So in some of these areas, the United States, you can kind of make it out here on the shoulders of the Americans have big, huge, giant American flag kind of ribbons tied to their shoulders. They've got big conspicuous American flags and they're blasting the Star Spangled Banner as they're coming aboard to try to convince the French to not fire on them, that the Americans are there to kick out the Germans and help free the French back in France. And so, relatively light resistance the Americans meet on the beaches of North Africa. And again, they find dogs and donkeys along the way as they're going from there in North Africa, as they begin to figure out what they're going to do next, a major conference is held between the French, the British, and the Americans at the town of Casablanca in 1943. And there at a press conference, kind of very flippantly and offhand, Roosevelt is asked after kind of the victories the Americans are having, what are the Allies going to accept for surrender? And he kind of just, without consulting everybody, just says, oh, we're only going to accept unconditional surrender from the Axis. Well, that flippant remark becomes U.S. policy, and that has huge implications later on through the war. Germany is going to be fighting to the last woman and child, right, in Berlin because of this flippant remark. The Japanese are going to be fighting after the United States has dropped an atomic bomb on them, right? Because the United States is only going to accept unconditional surrender. So this really has giant implications for hundreds of thousands of people throughout the war. And Roosevelt makes this remark without consulting everybody else. And because the United States won't accept any, you can keep the emperor, you can keep Hitler, any of that stuff, well, that just further forces the Nazis and the Germans and the Italians to dig in their heels even further. At Casablanca, the Americans are dead set. We want to help France out first. We want to invade there. Churchill again says, we want to do this. Churchill's building on his idea that he came up with in World War One of the idea of the soft underbelly of Europe, of attacking up through the south of Europe towards there. And so he argues them down to invasion of Italy, and that's where they go next. So Operation Anvil is the United States plan to invade Sicily, of which they do. And so they invade Sicily in July of 1943. They then successfully fight the Italians and Germans off the island of Sicily and force them there. They then invade into the Italian peninsula in September of 1943, and the Italian army collapses in around there. It's at that point that Hitler then sends the German army into Italy to help stop the Allies, and it's the German army that really turns the Italian peninsula into one line of fortresses after another. Italy has the Apennine range through the center part of the country, and so the Germans are able to really turn this into a series of lines of fortifications. So if this is our Italy, it's just one line after one line after one line that the Germans can repeatedly move there and really turns the fighting into a really hard and long slog up the peninsula. Um, and so it's really there. It's not until June of 1944 that the Allies are able to take the city of Rome, and they're still fighting in northern Italy when the war is over in May of 1945. So it's really a lot of hard fought fighting up the peninsula. So there's Roosevelt for the Americans, it's Charles de Gaulle leading the Free French armies, and that's Winston Churchill. There again at Casablanca is famous for its statement of unconditional surrender that the Allies are going to be accepting against Hitler's forces. So there's landing in Sicily, and again, from there, they're fighting their way through the Italian peninsula up there. And so again, just some we see African American soldiers in combat roles as infantrymen fighting in Italy, as well as the movement there. Again, by June of 1944, the Allies are going through Rome. There's the Colosseum, famously from there. And again, what do Americans do? They play baseball, whether they're in Italy or other places. After the invasion of Italy and as they're working up there, it's finally decided that the Allies are going to attack the Germans kind of front on. And General Eisenhower is taken off of leading the Americans in Italy and is put in charge of what's called Operation Overlord. Operation Overlord is the plan to invade Normandy in the north of France, be able to grab a foothold on the continent of Europe, be able to push the Nazis back into Germany and provide the second front that Stalin has been asking for and advocating for. The Allies begin to gather men and supplies in the United Kingdom in a major buildup in order to be able to put this operation into effect. We touched on this in world history, but a giant, huge deceptive plan is put on to bluff the Germans. An actual military commander, George C. Patton, who's run into some problems, right, public relationally and with this army and with the soldiers in Italy, is actually taken out of command in Italy and he's put into England as kind of just to be there as a fake, to lead a kind of a completely fake army. An entire army is fabricated um, out of thin air, but it has its own radio operations and it has its own real radio operators, women who would go and send telecommunications and telegrams and other stuff that would be leaked out there to the Germans. There, the British spies were able to turn German spies in Britain to be able to spit out false information as well. They created inflatable tanks and trucks and moved them all throughout the southern part of England to give the appearance of one false places where the invasion might take place, and also the appearance of a bigger force than actually was there. The movie industry in Great Britain actually used sound designers and engineers to capture rush hour traffic in London and other things and take these in big, huge, giant movie speakers to the beaches of England and blast them across the English Channel to make it sound like to the Germans in France that there was a big, huge, giant um, maneuvering of manpower and truck power from there. There's even the famous Operation Mincemeat, where the British found a dead bum in London, took him, put him in a army's officer's, put his corpse in an army officer's outfit, handcuffed to his wrist, a kind of dossier of all fake army plans for a fake landing um, in Normandy, away from the actual landings, dropped his body from a British submarine off the coast of Spain. The body washed up. The British, knowing that the Spanish would take this, give it over to the German spies in Spain, and then give it back there, were counting on this. So this is a big, huge, giant thing that they're coming up with. Operation Overlord is put into place on June 6, 1944. It begins earlier in the day, and shortly after midnight, three divisions of U.S. and British paratroopers and glider forces land in France, along with fake dummies as well, in order to provide uh, resistance, capture key, and hold routes to the beaches, and pretty much cause mass chaos behind the lines. As in the morning, the largest seaboard invasion in the history of the world is able to put off from there, and it is successful in landing troops along five different beaches for the British and the Americans. As you're probably very familiar with, fighting is pretty brutal. Landing on these beaches in some spots, Omaha Beach, where the U.S. First Division lands, is pretty famous. The first 30 minutes of movie Saving Private Ryan gives a small little glimpse of what the landing's like for there. And even in Omaha Beach, it was a pretty close run thing of the British actually beating the Americans back off to the sea before they were able to fight further up there. So again, we can spend entire classes just talking about the deception plan put on for Operation Overlord. Famously, a four soldiers can't lift a real tank, and so that should give you an idea that this is a inflatable fake tank. But from the air, it looks pretty darn real. They had inflatable trucks as well in order to give the appearance of any planes flying overhead that there was a massive military buildup in certain spots away from there, in not only dropping them paratroopers behind the line, but they also dropped these dummy paratroopers that had a whole bunch of false information on them and were rigged with firecrackers that, when they hit the ground, went off. So again, if you're a German soldier in the middle of the night and all of a sudden there's 500 of these dropping down you and starting shooting at you with what sounds like real gunfire, it's going to cause all sorts of problems from there. And again, that gives conflicting reports to the Germans back there. If one guy in one spot in the east is saying, "Hey, I've got a whole bunch of dummy paratroopers. What's this going about?" And another German officer saying, "No, they're real paratroopers." Well, then you've got to sort out information, and that takes precious time from the response. Again, the numbers on Operation Overlord and D-Day are staggering. And you can just read through some of those from where we don't have to get through all the nitty gritty. But again, this is the largest seaboard invasion in the history of the world, to be able to invade what Hitler calls Fortress Europe from there. That's Dwight D. Eisenhower right there, talking to the 101st Division soldiers as they're getting prepared to move, to hop in their planes and take off from that day. If you've read Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers, he's got a pretty good passage of describing 100 plus something pounds of gear and food and ammunition, along with the paratroopers that the paratroopers had to go on there. Some of the paratroopers needed help by their buddies in order to be able to push them into the plane with all the stuff that they were jumping off with, on top of the parachute and other stuff from there. So they're kind of jammed into these planes and wedged there before they're going to jump out of the airplanes and be able to go fight from there. And so again, we have British paratroopers and glider forces as well, including dog paratroopers, right, who landed with the forces through there. Uh, Pretty brutal fighting in some spots. Again, these are gliders that were made out of like balsa wood and light materials that, again, if we hit a tree or any other obstacle, are going to cause all sorts of problems from there. But from the paratroopers, flying overhead, and from pilots, we do get some examples of some eyewitness accounts of what they saw of the fleet dangled out before them. Um, Paratroopers and pilots described saying that a person could walk in the sky from wingtip to wingtip from England to France because of the amount of planes in the sky. And then soldiers and pilots would look down to the ground and said it was seen there were so many ships that one could walk from England to France and never get their feet wet, right? Because of all the ships there. Now, obviously, very high, a lot of hyperbole in those statements, but again, just a little bit of fraction just to give you some glimpse of what this would actually look like as you're doing that. So you have all these soldiers who are going by sea, and again, being crowded on these ships, transported, and then taken there along the way, to be able to land at the beach. So Saving Private Ryan is probably the most familiar cultural touchstone of what the fighting is, and again, that really can't even get you what truly was it like at some of these places. The photographer Robert Capa was the one of the few photographers that landed with the first wave of soldiers, and he landed at Omaha Beach, and he only was able to snap off 6 pictures that were only able to be developed later. He took, as a good photographer, hundreds of different ones, but because the fighting was so intense and so ferocious, and he was dipping and ducking and diving out of the way, only 6 of those pictures from the first wave were able to survive, and that's the small glimpse of stuff from there. So this is a colorized version of the same picture we just saw. But again, not a whole lot of stuff is they're landing on the beaches of Normandy. You're from there. Again, a famous Robert Capa picture, and you kind of get the sense of movement and peril that the soldiers are under. Lots of blood, guts, and gore. A lot of soldiers did not make it from this, and again, lots of different losses. But overall, in the grand scheme of things, uh, the landings were successful, and the Americans were able to, along with the British and Canadians, grab a toehold on Europe as they're pushing all this stuff in there. What does this open up? It allows for more ships to come in several days after, and what are they unleashing? You can see the doors open up from these landing ships, and trucks and jeeps and tanks and stuff that begins to land on Europe to be able to support these soldiers on there. And so if you go to Omaha Beach today, it's not, or any of the other beaches of uh, D-Day, they're not going to look like they did on that first when the landings occurred, because in the subsequent days, engineers and bulldozers and trucks came in to plow through roads and all the other stuff to be able to put all these things into place as more and more men, right, begin to land, come through there to be able to fight through France, right, through there, and again, finally reaching in August Paris as they liberate the Paris from there, and in time for the World Series back at home, be able to, for the soldiers to keep track of as they go and in places of the Eiffel Tower. So it's a pretty slow run thing as they move across Europe. They move pretty quickly from Paris, right, towards through the fall of 1944, and they make a costly gamble to try to attack Hitler north by taking over Antwerp and other ports that way in Operation Market Garden. That goes south. And as that is kind of recovering and they're beginning to solidify the supply lines, Hitler responds on December 16th, 1944, with a last gasp attack in the West. He throws his remaining divisions that he's been kind of saving and safeguarding, 8 German divisions, broke across a very weakly kind of spread out, thinly defended American defenses along an 80-mile front, catching the Americans by surprise. And what this does is on maps, particularly with newspapers back home, relaying this information to Americans creates a giant bulge in the map, and that gives the name to the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans drive the Allies 60 miles back and encircle and capture and kill the Allies as they move forward. Eventually, however, the success of the German counterattack kind of works against it because it begins to run out of momentum, it begins to run out of supplies, and more importantly, begins to run out of gasoline. When the attack was launched, the Germans knew they didn't have enough gasoline to be able to fully drive back to the sea. So they were planning on capturing supply routes and supply dumps along the way. And when they were unable to do that, they literally ran out of gasoline, and that's what helped turn the tide from this. What the Battle of the Bulge is going to represent is a decisive battle in the Eastern Front. At this point, the German losses in tanks, guns, and manpower are irreplaceable. The Americans, in particular, are able to put more and more stuff that the Germans, with being pounded day by the Americans and night by the British back in Germany, can't do that. And so the Germans, from this point, are only going to be able to retreat. And so that's what makes the Battle of the Bulge important in the grand scheme of the war. It marks a turning point to where the Germans are just retreating from there on out. The Battle of the Bulge is fought in some of the coldest temperatures in the entire century up to this point. So it's marked by extreme cold uh, from there, and you get a semblance of some of these pictures right from there. I had a great uncle who fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and he said that when it got to January and December, he never felt warm, right? Even though he was back in Chicago, right, in his house from there, because the snow would bring back memories of the frigid nights out in France and Belgium and little bit of Germany that he would experience. So one small little eyewitness thing. Eventually, the Americans are gonna fight their way across the earth, literally fighting their way in this picture across the rivers into Germany and move forward from there. Along the way, the Americans are finding and the Allies are finding the full horrors of what the Nazi regime and reign had put forth in terms of the Holocaust. It's the Soviets in the Eastern Front are the first to find the death camps and be able to report there, and the Americans are also finding that along the way. Eventually, the Americans make a deal, which is going to have important Cold War implications to allow the Soviet Union to have the quote unquote honor of going into Berlin, and they begin one of the largest artillery bombardments in history before invading the capital city. The invasion of Berlin is famous for intense building to building fighting. Hitler, in his bunker underneath the city, commits suicide on April 29th of 1945, and then his remaining high command sues for peace on May 8th of 1945, and that signifies victory in Europe. This comes to be known as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, and this ends the fighting in the European theater of operations. One person who doesn't get to see the end of the war, though, is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He um, is not really feeling well for most of 1945. On April 12th, he suffers a stroke and he dies. So even though Roosevelt has been elected to 4 terms, his fourth term in November of 1944 really only has him serve for a couple more months before he finally dies. And his vice president, who was newly added to the ticket for the 44 campaign, Harry Truman, now becomes the president of the United States of America. So, as noted, the Americans are going to be finding some of the Nazi death camps along the way in their path. And they're, as you probably can imagine, pretty upset about this. And so, this picture is documenting how American soldiers were shooting and killing some of the and holding for prisoners some of the Germans that they found in these camps right from there. The Americans make a deal. Eisenhower cuts a deal with the Russians for them to go into Berlin. And so this is a pretty famous photo that comes out of it. This is photoshopped. So like only some of it is actually real from there. And so if you go to an internet search, it's a pretty famous picture. It's all doctored up to make it look a little bit more important than what it actually is. So for the first time for many of these places in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe, um, the Nazis have been replaced. They're celebrating with the Americans, right? And so the Americans are not only liberating the death camps, they're liberating little puppy dogs, having a good time. But one person who doesn't is the dead President Roosevelt. This is taking just a few days. It's his last official portrait before he dies. You can kind of see in this picture how the years and the age and his health has caught up with him. And he finally passes away in April of 1945, which then gives away for Harry Truman from Missouri, all right, with just a high school diploma to now take over the United States and what it's going to be its role in the post-World War II world, with Joseph Stalin on his left and Winston Churchill on his right. And we'll pick up the story again another day.